The interesting thing about Wind at My Back is that it ended on this great Christmas romance. And the tough thing about the show in the beginning was that it tried to evoke a level of reality that people were not comfortable with in the beginning. The ending of Wind at My Back was left in an unusual position because we'd finished completing 65 episodes of the series. We'd shot it over 5 years. It was incredibly successful. But unfortunately, it was caught in the throes of rules and regulations of funding Canadian programming. Telefilm Canada was a main financial sponsor of the series, and at the time that the show was being produced, they had a rule that no Canadian television series would go beyond 65 episodes. So notwithstanding the fact that the ratings were extremely high and that CBC wanted to do more, we were caught in the hairs of a kind of a bureaucratic function of equity investment that was coming from Telefilm.
Yeah, well, thanks. I guess.
Wait.
That was also sort of the impetus of doing the Christmas movie, is that the series itself was kind of left in this sort of limbo state where, you know, Van had gone away and Grace realizes that maybe he wasn't such a bad guy after all, and so there was all these kind of cliffhanger questions left at the end of the series.
About a year and a half after we finished completing principal photography on the 65th episode, CBC called and said, "We desperately need a Christmas movie. How quickly can you develop a script around Wind at My Back?" And this was like 2 months that we had to develop a script. Usually on a movie, we'd spend about a year. So we quickly worked up a concept and we put it into production immediately that August. The big challenge with mounting the production so quickly was that none of the original sets for Wind at My Back even existed at that point. Everything had been dismantled.
And because of us having to essentially rebuild all these corners of sets, because of course when we were shooting the Wind at My Back, the series, we had all of the sets and all of their scope. In this particular case, we basically had to like cherry pick out of the script and go, okay, well we need this part of the Sutton apartment and we need this part of the hotel lobby and we need, and build just those very specific elements and then cut it into other elements that we already had.
In addition, certain performers that we wanted to actually have in the script, like Catherine Greenwood and Shirley Douglas, were completely unavailable. Kathy had just gone off to have a baby and Shirley was off doing another production, and so they were not available, so we had to kind of write the script around that. The prospect of writing a Christmas movie you would have thought would have focused on Grace, but since she wasn't available, we had to change gears quickly and really look at the next romantic scenario, which was Hub.
That's right for you. You make yourself the center.
I don't mean to.
Oh, not like people who grab you and force you. There's something in you that's so good, so true. Makes everyone turn to you.
I would have said the same thing about you.
So that was sort of became a retool of the whole concept of the show. And, you know, the sort of juxtaposition of Hub, you know, pursuing a career in the priesthood and then meeting this Jewish girl who was sort of embroiled in what became sort of the precursor to World War II and having to leave, you know, really sort of threw a whole different twist into what would have been sort of the Wind at My Back dynamic.
The other enormous challenge was the fact that it was a very tight schedule and a very tight budget. Even the very last scene where Hub says goodbye to the love of his life, we created out of a few flats and a boat and some snow, and yet it was magical, partly because Stefan Skaney is such a good director and he was able to really shoot the whole thing like it was on a postage stamp but make it look like it was $1 million.
You're like a star, Hubert. Shining in the sky for me. My light in the darkness.
I love you.
So we were greatly indebted to his talents at making this whole wonderful family story come to life, and you know, it was ironic that it was being shot in the middle of summer and yet we were creating Christmas and snow and everything.
I think Wind at My Back was similar to Road to Avonlea in the sense that it really focused on family values and things like that. But Wind at My Back was much grittier. It had more of a realistic flavor to it as opposed to Avonlea, I think, was a bit more idyllic.
An audience had grown up watching 7 seasons of Road to Avonlea. They liked the sort of escapist fantasy of Avonlea and the beautiful pastoral settings. Wind at My Back was a completely different kettle of fish.
The series, when it first began, was quite serious. It was quite dramatic, and you know, there was obviously comical moments in it and things like that, but I think that it was a serious time, and the world basically was gearing up for World War II, and a lot of those political issues were at play, and the people living in that period couldn't really escape it as much as they tried.
The notion behind Wind at My Back, that it was a realistic series and not a romantic fantasy, still went out in our development of the script for this Christmas episode.
Actually, Fat, this is just as important.
It's not your job to save the world, Hub.
Mom, if you can bury your head in the sand and hope Hitler will go away, that's fine. I can't. Excuse me.
I was going to set in order to just to see what was happening, check in with Stefan, check in with Monique, who's the AD, and you know, whatever. And I walk into the studio, and I'm like, everybody's just standing around the monitor by set, and you know, I'm miffed about this, right? Something like, what's going on? Like, why isn't something happening?
The whole prospect of shooting a Christmas film and having an international terrorist disaster like 9/11 impinge on the production of the movie was daunting, to say the very least.
We're watching the monitors again on the news, and the second plane hits, and then there's just this pall kind of falls over the whole set.
We stopped production, and the entire team stood around the cameras watching television, watching George Bush come on television, watching the Twin Towers actually collapse as we're trying to create an impression of having Christmas with opening Christmas presents in the tree and everything else, and it took the bloom off the rose of that scene. It was very difficult to get everyone to even focus that day to complete photography. But looking back, it makes you realize that hard times happen to people, but the human spirit prevails, and I think America was a great example of that. You know, the fact that they were standing up for freedom both during the Second World War and during this war on terrorism. And so in some ways, Wind at My Back is a backdrop for all of that, both then and now. It's interesting to look at those events in that context and to realize what the bigger picture is all about. Now that the show is playing on the Inspiration Network in the United States and on CTV, Bravo, and the W Channel here in Canada, Wind at My Back is getting the kind of exposure that it's never had before. And people are falling in love with these characters, even though the kids have all grown up and the cast have moved on to do other things. It was a magical place in time, and it belied what Avonlea was, which had become a kind of a huge, overblown production with stars and everything else. Wind at My Back was simple and yet true. And I think the fact that you're looking at an ensemble perform together so intimately and so perfectly every time speaks to the caliber of the writing, the acting, the directing, and the production itself, and the people who made it.